me a little bit about the picture.
This is the undercover guys I assumed when I was buying the heroin that got me in temporary trouble because we actually bought it. But it's funny because I've been undercover in disguise often, but I've had some pretty close calls. I remember one where I bought a kilo of cocaine. This one, at that time, I was in Florida, under the aegis of the authorities. The key was candid camera was the key for the cops to come bust down the door once I had actually bought the kilo of cocaine from the bad guys. And so just before that happened, one of the bad guys says to me, "You know, you look like that guy Geraldo Rivera." And I said, "What the hell you mean? God damn it, you came here to sell dope or what?" You know, I know I blusted my way through. And then he consummated the transaction, and after I tested it, I was testing it on camera, on hidden camera. And I tested it and put it in this acid, it turned blue. So I said, "You know what? This is cocaine. I am Geraldo Rivera, and you're on candid camera." At that, the cops came busting in, and the guy, "You got 10 years. I always thought he was going to come looking for me after he got out and kill me, but he never did. So at least I'm still here."
All right, let's talk about Willowbrook. How did you come to that story in the first place?
Going back to the Young Lords, because but for the Young Lords, I never would have gotten the Willowbrook story. Here's why. We had, much like Occupy Wall Street has a medical wing where activists, nurses, and doctors and other kinds of medical technicians are involved. The Young Lords also had activists, progressive doctors, anti-war, civil rights activists. And two of the doctors who were caring for the Young Lords and their lawyer and people in the community later went to work for the federal government in Staten Island at the public health hospital out there. And they complained to me that many of the nurses, the LPNs, the licensed practical nurses, were Native Americans who were specifically recruited under a federal program that existed in 1971, where they were taken off the reservations, and they were trained and given the LPN certification. But then when they went to work in federal hospitals, they were paid less than other LPNs, and the doctors complained to me, and I went out to Staten Island with these two doctors, one of whom was Dr. Michael Wilkins. And did this story about how unfair it was and how they were still on a reservation in a sense, these licensed practical nurses from these Indian women. So jump cut, these doctors, after they get fired for blowing the whistle, went to work at Willowbrook. So they go to work at Willowbrook, which was at the time the world's largest institution that we know of for the mentally retarded, the people we then called mentally retarded. 6,500 at its peak. Wow. in the 60s. So they were working at Willowbrook, and there was, and they helped formulated a kind of low velocity revolt going on there, being pushed by the parents and certain activist staffers like these doctors, like Dr. Wilkins and the others. And they were getting very little traction. It was December 1971. They had Andrew Stein, the local assemblyman, who had his own political aspirations. But they got into Staten Island Advance, the newspaper out there a couple times, one or two minor stories in other publications. I'm not sure if the Times had done anything at that point. And it's not like Willowbrook had not been exposed before. That was 1971, 1972. But in 1965, then Senator Robert F. Kennedy had gone to Willowbrook, and he called it a snake pit. He was very emotional. His own sister, Rosemary, as you know, was developmentally disabled herself. But still, the story didn't take off. But then I said, that's the problem with these stories. What am I going to get? I'm going to a brick building and a couple of angry parents, and what am I going to do? They said, we can get you a key because we're quitting. And that's what they did. They got me a key to Building 6, and I, along with my camera crew, jumped over the fence and used the key and opened the door to building number 6, first the A ward and then the B ward, and we filmed everything we could, and went on from there.
Yeah. What do you remember? Any specific images or parts of that report that seemed to resonate so much?
Well, a couple of things, obviously. I met my friend Bernard Carabello, who has cerebral palsy, but had been misdiagnosed as retarded, as mentally challenged, or whatever you call it these days. And he would just turned 21, so he had just become old enough for my activist doctor friends to sign him out of there. So I met Bernard, who remains my dearest friend. He had a life expectancy of age 30. He's now 62, and he's about to retire after a life spent as a civil servant working for the New York State Department of Retardation, or now Developmental Disabilities, so Bernard. And then I remember, and it is the nightmare of my life, and it conjures up the most extreme reaction. And this is the 40th anniversary, and it's so funny that it still lives in me so viscerally and immediately. But I just, however experienced I was on the streets, I had never, ever seen anything like that. I mean, you go into a room, maybe the size of this office, and it's just crammed with kids who are naked or smeared with their own feces, and they're wailing and they're unattended, and it's just horrible, and I never forget it. But I tell you what, that story, I think you could argue that story was the most important local news story ever done in terms of television, not only exposing something, because that was almost the easy part, but then working to use the leverage of the media, to use the outrage of the media and harness it for positive social change. That started a chain reaction. And you ask anybody in the field now. I mean, the proudest moments I have, and it still happens every week or two. So I'm a social worker, and I became a social worker because of your Willowbrook exposés. I got into the field, or I'm an advocate, or I'm a lawyer, whatever, working in that field. It's one of the most gratifying aspects of my life. But it really was not just complaining about the story, but also promoting an alternative to the institutions. That was the end of the Bedlam model, the 19th century institutionalization of all people with disabilities, which persisted from Bedlam, which was a physical place. It's an institution called Bedlam in England, and it became the model for the Western world. Big institutions, you throw everybody there, they become kind of a catch basin. Anyway, whatever their disability, and then you don't have to worry about them. Basically, they presumably they live out their lives and whatever situation, but it's out of sight, out of mind, and that's the model that existed until these exposés began a process toward the de-institutionalization of the care of the mentally retarded, the developmentally disabled, and. Now there are no big institutions in this country. Indeed, there are no big institutions in the Western world now. Sometimes the buildings are still occupied partially. They have, they've been decentralized even within the buildings, but many of the buildings are just like the one on Randall's Island. They just are empty, or mostly empty, or they've been turned over, become colleges, or like Willowbrook itself. But basically, the care of the developmentally disabled has been de-institutionalized. They are in small, community-based residences where there's 4, 6, or 8, or their home. A whole host of programs have been developed There's been a recognition that regardless of disability, there is human potential. Many have jobs now. Many are educated. Many get married. It's a whole. The world has changed in 40 years in that regard. There are still challenges, plenty of challenges, particularly as the government cuts back on services. But clearly, institutionalizing people with disabilities only enhanced their disabilities, didn't alleviate them, and it destroyed lives and wasted capital. But that's my proudest achievement.
Yeah. Were you aware when you used that key and got inside what a charged, powerful story this was, or did that really only come in the aftermath with the reaction?
No. I was already, by that time, remember, I had already run the Columbia DuPont Award for the drug crisis in East Harlem. I was already a celebrity. I was already, I'd probably done 100 stories by then. So I understood, when you have the goods, you have the goods. So I rushed back from Staten Island, and it was film in those days. And it physically had to be edited. You had to cut the film, and then, I'm sorry, I get mustache in my tears. But I told the assignment editor, we had phoned from Staten Island. A motorcycle courier had met us to take the film back. We raced back, and we put it together, and we put it on the air, and I knew it was hot stuff, but I had no idea. I mean, you cannot anticipate, however experienced you are, the public's reaction to something. But whatever it was, whether it was a dearth of other competing stories, or the fact that we had already begun to ascend to the top of the pile, not just me personally, but Eyewitness News. That show, the early news, when we put that on the air, was like a journalistic explosion. There was such a societal outrage. I mean, it was like everyone saw it and said, "Oh my God, I had no idea. How could this happen?" And the rage was largely directed at Governor Nelson Rockefeller and the staff, management, the administration at Willowbrook and similar institutions. But it was a tsunami of public outrage that was impossible to ignore, and I think impossible to replicate, and ultimately had enough momentum that it became a catalyst that caused a significant sea shift in the way an entire segment of the American population is cared for.
Yeah, so it's a kind of harvest of shame. And one question I have, you're not in local news anymore. Is local news doing enough like this, today? Just as an aside, I'm curious, I mean, is it taking advantage of that potential to transform institutions and focus on issues?
A couple of things happened in local news after my day, after I had already gone on to network. I think foremost among them was the advent of the live truck, where reporters no longer went like SEAL Team 6, commando raids to get the story in East Harlem or the South Bronx. Suddenly the live truck meant you brought this corporate vessel with you, and you also had the obligation to be on the air from that location in that truck, and it also that limited the news gathering abilities. I think there became much more emphasis on the personalities and the liveness, the technology, than there should have been. And I don't want to be like the typical old fogey and say, "Oh, in my day we used to do more and better." I don't believe that's necessarily true, But I think there are real constraints now on the ability of an individual reporter to spend the time and energy to get the key and get into the building and get the goods and come back out of the building. There's much too much, I think. Live truck using the disaster du jour as kind of scenery. Behind me, the building is burning. Behind me, the occupiers are chanting. Behind me, the traffic is intolerable. So I think that was the main limiting factor. There's still a lot of great work done. I mean, if you just check the Polka Wars at LIU,
Right.
you see there's a lot of fine journalism still going
Absolutely. How did you end up meeting John Lennon and Yoko Ono as a result of the Willowbrook story?
Well, they were avid viewers. John and Yoko were avid viewers of Eyewitness News, and Yoko called me, within a day or two of the original episode. They were living down on, I think, Beekman Street. We're down in the village, in the West Village, and it was their love-in apartment. They interviewed everybody in their big king-size bed in the back room of this railroad apartment down in the village. And she just called me and said, "Hey, let's be friends." And I went down there, and we started hanging out. We had met once before, actually, but we started hanging out, and ultimately they would do the last fully rehearsed concert of John's life as a benefit to help the Willowbrook kids.
Yeah. You want to say anything about that experience and your relation with John Lennon, how it developed?
I love John Lennon. First of all, I was a big Beatles fan. I had long hair because of the Beatles. They didn't have any mustaches, at least not at that time. They had at various points in their career, but I just love the Beatles. I came actually to know all of them. I had met George Harrison first in 1971. He and Ravi Shankar did the concert for Bangladesh. And I got to know George and Sal Swimmer, who was a producer, Alan Klein, who formed the Apple Records. And they made the template with the concert for Bangladesh in Madison Square Garden in 1971. It became the model where big stars could have big musical events for reasons other than kind of a love-in, which is not a fundraiser, or political rallies. This was for a cause. George and Robbie, and they did a magnificent job, and it was a wonderful concert. People forget it now, but it was just extraordinary in terms of its power and in terms of its effectiveness. And in terms of my own private life, aside from the showing me, educating me that this was a way to make money for a cause, it also introduced me to that whole level of rock and roll stars, and I styled myself as the rock and roll newsman. And so it was natural for me to hang out with George Harrison. It was natural for me to hang out with John Lennon. And, it became the jet setification of Geraldo in a way that was ultimately, I think, damaging to my journalistic career, or certainly my journalistic credibility, but it sure was fun. And hanging out with John, who totally had my sensibilities. He was anti-war. He was pro-civil rights. He was pro-women's rights. He was, an adopted New Yorker. He wanted to be here. He wanted to hang out, and wanted to make love, not war. And it's just became good friends. And I was honored to be around him and Yoko. And they later, when I asked, agreed to do the concert at Madison Square Garden. I mean, it was a rocky road because they are rock and rollers and the whole world is at their footsteps. But John was also being plagued at the time by the immigration department that wanted to get him deported. And something, it's funny that the first illegal alien I championed was John Lennon, and now it's the big source of friction here at Fox and me. But that's another story. It just was wonderful, and just hanging out with them, and they introduced me to people like Shanna Na and Roberta Flack and Stevie Wonder, who did these concerts for me, and later John Denver when he was as big as the Beatles, and the Allman Brothers and Charlie Daniels, and just like on and on. We just did event after event, and I became kind of the pro bono impresario, just hosting this event and that event. More often than not, pegged toward making money to get the people out of the institutions.
Right. In what other respects did did the Willowbrook story change your career? What had its impact in going forward?
Well, there's a picture there. Yeah, I'm looking at Kurt Vonnegut, and there's Senator Jacob Javits, and Luis Martins, a Panamanian billionaire, and Marion Javits. I just became a member of the jet set. I became a total. I was on the culture pages and the scene pages. Here, this is the publication. Thanks. This is a publication party for the Willowbrook book, and also there was Frank Sinatra. I have another picture: Frank Sinatra and Henry Kissinger. So there I was a kid, a local newsman who had been making $250, a year before, and then suddenly I was, making hundreds of thousands of dollars and hanging out with Henry Kissinger and Frank Sinatra and Kurt Vonnegut. So it became, and John Lennon. So it was quite a ride. It was quite an intense time.
And what about your transition?
It also nationalized me. It also took me from being a New York phenomenon to having a national program that just brought me everywhere.
Right. And what about that? Must have been a factor in your becoming a correspondent for ABC News and leaving.
Not yet. It's interesting that you say that. I initially thought that was going to be my road to nationalizing, and I did have one big national assignment in that period. When 1973 was my first network assignment. I was assigned to cover the coup in Chile, where Pinochet took over. General Pinochet took over and killed Salvador Allende and the democracy in Chile. And I went there, covered that, and then from there I went straight to the Yom Kippur War. But then my network news career wasn't going anywhere because Eyewitness News refused to release me. That was one thing. But then I hired an agent, my first agent, a guy named Jerry Weintraub, whose dad was a jeweler here in town.
Yeah.
Jerry Weintraub, now Ocean's 11 and best friends with George Clooney and Brad Pitt. He's a mogul, a multi-millionaire mogul. But then he was a humble agent. He only represented a couple of rock and roll acts, but he chose to represent me. I was his first newsman client, and he came up with an idea that if the network news guys weren't being open-armed and receptive to you, why don't we create our own news program, for your generation, for the hipster generation, we'll do it late night on ABC Network. And so that's where Good Night America was created, and that became my first national program.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that. You mentioned the Arab-Israeli War in '73. Were there rumors that you had staged
yes,
a military attack, and what was that about briefly?
There was I forget the name of the correspondent who started it, but I can tell you why it became famous. Let me tell you what happened first of all. And then, we were in the Golan Heights, and we were shelled by the Syrians. And on camera, you could see one mortar hits there, and I'm in the middle, and another mortar hits there. In those days, remember you had the Filmo camera with no sound on it, and the big camera with sound on it. So the Filmo camera had no sound on it. So that's what captured the images of the mortar explosions. And the sound came from the other camera. And so, particularly when you see artillery in the distance, you see the flash going at the speed of light, you see it, and then you hear the sound, whatever, 1 second per mile, right, generally speaking. So when you put it together, you put the flash and the sound concurrently.
Right.
Yeah. So that was the source of the rumor, which was properly investigated and dismissed by Av Weston, who later became my boss. But when I came back from the war, I was doing a cover story for Rolling Stone magazine, and the reporter said to me, "You have to know that everyone in the newsroom is talking about how you staged the attack in the Golan Heights." And I said, who's talking about that? Because I hadn't heard that. So he told me Roger Grimsby, the co-anchor of the Eyewitness News team, and he's a Korean War vet. He said, that sound was hinky, whatever he said, that I staged it. So I said, Roger Grimsby told you that? He said, yeah, but don't tell him. I'm not going to do this story. Don't tell Roger Grimsby. So anyway, later that evening, between the 6 o'clock and the 11 o'clock news, I told Roger Grimsby to come down to my office at 77 West 66th Street. And I said to him, when we got face to face, did you tell this reporter, Joe XYZ, that I had staged it? He said, well, yeah, I told him that. So anyway, I beat up Roger Grimsby. I physically beat him up in the basement of the newsroom. And I said I was going to kill him, and I was beyond, it was a terrible, terrible moment of unbridled wrath and retribution. Mm-hmm. And he went on the news anyway. He went on the news all banged up. He put whatever makeup he could on it, and he never ratted me out. And I never liked him. I still don't like him, but I credit his manliness and not ratting me out. Okay. But anyway, I never staged anything in my life. Yeah. To jump cut to your.
All right, let's go back. Good Night America.
Speak.
Let's get back briefly to Good Night America. The types of stories you covered, how this show was different.
Good Night America was branded the second generation TV news magazine. I called it that. The first generation being 60 Minutes, which was already on the air and established. But we're going to be the second generation TV news magazine. And this is before Letterman or Leno or Saturday Night Live or any of those, the late night shows. The Tonight Show was on. That was the only one. So we were the counterculture news magazine. And our biggest story was when I got a hold of the Zapruder footage of the Kennedy assassination. It had been purchased immediately after the assassination in 1963 by Time Life. But they decided not to do anything with it other than the freeze frames that they used in the original magazine stories not long after the assassination of the 35th president. So I got my hands on it, and we were going to air it. And we advertised that we were going to air it, and Time Life said they were going to sue me. And I said, well, you've archived this footage, and you're suppressing knowledge, and people are very suspicious of the Warren Commission and the official findings, and the best evidence is the Zapruder film. I'm going to run it. And they said, they're going to sue me. And anyway, ABC News and then ABC Entertainment came to me and they said that I couldn't run it unless I indemnified the network. In other words, I had to write an indemnification, whereas if Time Life sued the network, I would be fully financially responsible. So I said, okay, I'll sign it. And I did.
Did they sue?
And that was the first example where fair use was used successfully. And they never sued me after threatening it, being confronted with the concept of fair use.
Right.
They never threatened me. It was our highest rated program, and it's still talked about. Every generation says, Geraldo Rivera, and I always generate a different response depending on whether you knew me in the talk show days or 2020 days. But it was always, did you know he ran the Zapruder film, the first one to ever run it? And oh, yeah. So it's, my son, I know, was very impressed, my 32-year-old son, when he became a 16-year-old savant.
Right. How did you enjoy having your own program as opposed to being part of a team?
Well, I loved it, and I stayed on Eyewitness News. Eyewitness News paid the bills. I by that time was I was getting paid celebrity wages, and I could afford to do it. And it was really a strutting time in my life, really a jet set time. I had Engelbert Humperdinck sideburns and big bushy hair and elevator shoes, and my mustache was big and droopy. And,
yeah.
I loved it, and I got to meet, whatever rock star was a Quran, I met them, whatever celebrity artist, and going here and there. It was fun.
Yeah. Why did ABC cancel the show in '77?
Well, it's really, the show was in a time slot where it wasn't my own. It wasn't that I wasn't on every Thursday. It was on every other Thursday, and it was the wide world of entertainment. I alternated with Dick Cavett, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday had other programming, and they just did away with that whole concept. And they went with, I forget which show they ultimately went with late night. Now, of course, it's Nightline, but it was also almost concurrent with Roone Arledge coming from sports to ABC News. And Roone made it very clear to Jerry Weintraub, who still represented me, that he wanted to bring me, that to the extent that Bill, I forget his name, he went on to be the head of PR for Ford Motor Company, where Bill, I forget, not Sherman, Bill, something like that, something Irish, but where the previous president was standoffish and had me at arm's length, Roone was the opposite. He was the great showman. He embraced me. And that was right around '77. So I went to work, and they basically did a lot of work in Latin America in '77 for ABC News. I was still, no, I went completely. I was, Good Morning America.
Yeah, see, that's
Good
what I
Morning
was going to
America.
ask you about.
November of 1975, Good Morning America happened. So you had Good Night America happened. It started in '73. Good Morning America started in '75. So I was really fully engaged in the network stuff by then. And Roone said, "Come on, you have to leave Good Morning America. You have to leave Good Night America. You're going to work for me now." That was '77, and then 1978, of course, is when 2020 started.
Right. What was it? All right. Was it you're becoming a correspondent for ABC Evening News? This is, I guess, what you're talking about. Anything more you want to say about your relationship with him and how he, sort of enhanced your career or moved it in certain directions?
Russell Van Brunt, I told you, my high school principal, was so seminal there. Harry Koblenz, my first father-in-law, was seminal there. Fred Friendly, and then to a lesser extent, but still substantial, Al Primo. The next big figure in my life is Roone Arledge. Larger than life, gregarious, creative, up close and personal. He made sports, journalism what it is today, just fantastically successful. He had a 2-page obit in the New York Times for good reason. He was a man who saw in me, he saw through the kind of the putrid atmosphere that many had toward me in the news business. They overstay, it's not that bad, but the standoffishness. I wasn't one of the in crowd.
Why was that? Because of the celebrity aspect?
Yeah, because of my own making. I mean, when you wear Engelbert Humperdinck sideburns and platform shoes and long curly hair, and you hang out in clubs, it's hard for people to take you seriously as either an intellectual or a professional journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Roone didn't care about any of that stuff. He just wanted me to get the story. And my most important story that year, I remember, was something very modest. It was in Nebraska, and it was a story about how the kids were all leaving the Midwest, going for the coasts or wherever, and their parents were living back in the old homestead, being supported just on Social Security, and often widows or widowers in these big old houses. So I called it Old, Cold, and Poor. And I remember I got a note from Roone Arledge. She said, "Brilliant," and I love the simplicity of the title. And it's some things that's so funny. That's from 1977. I remember the note. But Roone really embraced me, and then didn't care. People complained. Son of Sam happened in '77. I did that for the network, to much criticism from the establishment, because I remember they gave on the Barbara Walters, Harry Reasoner newscast 20 minutes to that New York story, Son of Sam, the day he was caught. And I was the lead correspondent, and they were furious about that. In Washington, Sam Donaldson, Ted Koppel, they talked about it at Roone's his memorial service on Park Avenue, the big church, I think it was St. Bartholomew.
What, they felt it wasn't a legitimate national
Oh no,
story?
they complained that it was, it was a tabloid story, although they hadn't coined that phrase yet. That it was not their standard and cheesy story, and why was I the lead correspondent? And on and on. Rune didn't even respond to them, and as Koppel quipped very cleverly at the memorial service for Rune. But Rune was someone who became my best friend in many ways. He was clearly my mentor, my protector. He gave me a fabulous salary and never held me back. Again, they didn't give me many assignments, but gave me airtime whenever I had a story. And then when 2020 began, I think I was his first choice.
Anything you want to say just in general about where ABC Evening News stood in relation to the other networks at the time, and what happened, and also your work with Av Weston as executive producer?
Av was great. Av was very creative. He was Rune's go-to guy. Very clever, very modern. He understood that the old form, the kind of ponderous talking head, was obsolete. The television was about movement, and the world was a canvas that he wanted me to go to the four corners of to paint and bring back the images of. And so Av was, the hands-on kind of executive who was putting Rune's vision to work, but Rune was the maestro.
Yeah.
Rune was the orchestra leader. He was the he was the man whose vision of that intense intimacy of sports coverage, that he thought would apply to news as well, and that I could be a person that could bring that to the news. And he just gave me that wonderful, wonderful chance, and in prime time, a network in prime time. I mean, you can't ask for a bigger, more important platform, and he gave it to me. I'll never forget him for that.
How was the fit, your fit with the other people on the evening news? Barbara Walters, Harry Reasoner.
I love Barbara, and I've had a crush on her since 1977 when we covered the Panama Canal together. I hit on her and she rejected me a million times. But her birthday, when it came, her 75th birthday, I jumped out of the birthday cake on her show, The View. So I still love her. And I've got a million pictures of her here in the office, too.
And why did you leave ABC?
Well, let me get back to how I got along with those other correspondents. I didn't get along with them at all. I didn't have I had no relationship with them. Because Rune Arledge used to have a little, like a cocktail party in his office to watch the newscast, the evening newscast. And remember, the stories were almost always on tape. There were very few live correspondents on the set or live shots. That didn't exist in those days. So that was his inner circle, and I was always invited to that. So I didn't need the other correspondents. I didn't care about the other correspondents. If they were snobby about me, what did I care? Because Big Daddy was my buddy. And that's what characterized those ABC years. I had very little to do with the big news stars of the day, but I had everything to do with Rune and his inner circle.
Mm-hmm. And did you leave the evening news to go to 2020?
Yes. Basically, so 77 was all about the news, and now I remember it was the Panama Canal Treaty. Jimmy Carter was, that's what was happening. That's what dominated the news. Watergate was over. Jerry Ford was fading into the distant past, and the Panama Canal was everything about America reassessing its place in the world and all the rest of it. Yeah. But 2020 happened. It was a tryout in the summer of 1978, and Rune said, "I want you to do it," and I did it.
Okay. And how would you describe the format of the show and how it was received?
Initially, it was not well received at all. It wasn't the stories. It was a typical magazine format. It wasn't that revolutionary. It was two anchors, and they introduced
the stories of the various correspondents on the team. The anchors only lasted 1 week. The ratings were disastrous. My first story was widely criticized. It was about the abuse of racing greyhounds, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty good story, I think. It was just, I think, it was more the choice of what the story was about. Oh, this is what he's going to talk about, dogs and by the third week, I did a Rolling Stones story, a profile of Mick Jagger. They said, "Oh, that's what he should do. Stick to that stuff that he knows, not the real hard stuff." But the anchors were gone in the first week, and they brought in Hugh Downs, who became a great friend, a wonderful colleague with whom I would often go in the field. We had shared a lot of interests: racing sailboats, having perilous adventures, trekking the wild. He was a wonderful guy. He was already had the bad rap of being too old for television in 1978. I think he's still doing it now. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. I came to know and love him, and he took over as anchor, and the show took off and became a fixture in the same way 60 Minutes. It was much less now. I argue that once I left, it lost that cachet, but that's in the eye of the beholder.
Was it the story of Elvis Presley's death, was that one of the big stories for you on 2020?
The Elvis cover-up, which happened in 78, many argue that's what made 2020. It was the highest-rated documentary ever. It was the highest-rated 2020 until Barbara's Monica Lewinsky interview, and it's still the second highest-rated. Got like a 43 share of the audience. It was something extraordinary, and basically it was the grim, melancholy story of the prescription pill junkie that Elvis had become, and ultimately cost him his life.
Yeah. What led you to leave 2020 in '86? ABC released a statement that you had chosen to move on. I mean,
Yeah,
what was the real story there?
Well, there's it's a long story, but I'll give you the bullet points. In 1985, I was, 2020 was number one in its time slot, and I was the number one reason. I think it's fair to argue if you look at my stories, not just Elvis. I was always in the A block, almost always. Many times I had multiple segments. Many times I had the full hour. It was really a wonderful vehicle for me. It was a great way to tell important stories. Jump cut to 1985. After 8 years, Sylvia Chase does a story about the alleged relationship between Marilyn Monroe, the sex symbol of her time, and both Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States, and his brother, the President of the United States. And it's funny that I talk about this. Doug Kennedy, Bobby's son, is my office mate here. He's next door. So Sylvia Chase does this story, and I think she had enough. That was before Judith Exner, I think her name was, Gambino's mistress, that he shared with the President of the United States, and it was about, did Marilyn Monroe really kill herself with prescription drugs, an accidental overdose, or was she killed to silence her? It was a story still to this day that's provocative, although it's been told and told and told. Sylvia did the story. Roone killed the story. It was the first time he had ever killed the story. He spiked the story. By that time, I had stopped hanging out with Roone in the office cocktail party. I was no longer a member of the inner circle socially, although I was, as I said, the big draw in 2020 and an important personality. So Sylvia does the story. She calls me. She complains. Barbara Walters calls me. Hugh Downs calls me. Everybody is upset that Roone has killed the story. What are we going to do about it? So feeling on the one hand hurt that I'm no longer in Roone's inner circle, but I had just negotiated my new 3-year contract. But I didn't negotiate with Roone. As I typically did, I negotiated with an underling. So again, that was part of the social perceived slight. So I have an attitude about Roone. Sylvia comes to me with the story. I said, God damn it, he can't get away with that. He's killing that story because he's best friends with Ethel Kennedy. that Rune killed the story about her husband and her brother-in-law because of Ethel. And so People magazine called me, and I told them. That's what I said, and Rune could not believe it. He was so hurt and furious at me, and he wanted me fired. And make a long story short, I got fired.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of other tales told around that time, but that led me to write a book. I wrote an article about it. You might get a hold of Esquire magazine, big story I wrote. I think it was Esquire. And
then came...
I was fired. I was the most famous unemployed person in America. And I was desperate because I'd spent all the money I'd made, basically, not all of it, but I had a tremendous nut. I was divorced from Edie, I was divorced from Linda Koblenz. I had married a third woman in California. I was taking care of everyone, all my siblings, my huge extended family. I had a nut that was about $50,000 a month. So I had some money in the bank, but not a whole lot. But my goal, because I was so hurt and so, in a way, embarrassed to be unemployed, my announced goal, I didn't want to go looking for a job. No one called me. So I decided to sail my boat around the world. And so I got in my sailboat New Wave, and I set off filming it. I went to Cuba. There's a picture of me and Castro over there, and went to various ports in Central America, and I hit the Panama Canal heading toward California. And that's when I got the call to do a syndicated special about this Chicago era gangster, and that became a whole other story.
Right. You wanted to say anything you want to say briefly about the mystery of Al Capone's vault before we go on?
Well, remembering that Elvis Presley was the highest rated network documentary segment ever, Al Capone's vault, for all the burlesque trappings, became and still is the highest rated syndicated special ever. It was a great idea. 2 hours. They had found this vaulted space underneath his old headquarters in South Chicago in the Lexington Hotel, and the idea was to open it on live television. And so the way I formulated the show was 2 hours, so I said, let's do an hour on the gangster era, the Roaring Twenties, Al Capone, and then the other hour would be the digging and the finding, and we expected bodies and money and weapons, and the damn thing was empty.
Yeah.
But
so how did this? It was a rating success, but how did this affect your career?
Because this is for the archives, it wasn't a rating success. It was a historic broadcast watched by more people than the Super Bowl. We did a 70 share in Chicago. We did a 65 share, I think, something like that, in Los Angeles, and everybody knew that the damn thing was empty by then, and they still watched. It was the highest rated syndicated special ever. It was broadcast live in 12 different countries. But I also knew that all of my former colleagues, all the snobs who had kind of given me the cold shoulder during those years at ABC, were watching it and ridiculing me. So I was humiliated when the show ended in Chicago. It was live, as I said. I went across the street with my wife, Cece, at that time. We weren't married yet. Maybe we were married. No, we weren't married. We were about to get married. So we went across to the Mexican restaurant, and I got drunk on tequila. I went back to the hotel, the Hyatt Hotel, and I was going to go back to my boat, and because you didn't know anything about success in those days. So I knew that I had wrecked my reputation, that I had fallen into the trap where I was exactly the caricature that everyone said I was, and I'd never work again in the business. And then that's the way I fell asleep drunk, and I didn't take any phone calls, I didn't take any messages, didn't let anyone in. Cece kind of opened the door the next day to the room service guy. I'll never forget him. It was an old black man, old thin black man. He looked like the kind of guy, had the kind of dignity that the old railroad porters did, real very composed and smart and dignified. And he pushes in, he sees me looking down, he says, puts his arm around me at some point and says, "Don't worry, son, they're not going to blame you for the bad news." That the damn thing was empty, and he handed me 22 messages. I had 22 job offers the next day. So, what was the low point of my career became the start of a whole new career.
And so, going forward, so how did then Geraldo, the talk show, the Geraldo talk show, come about? Was that right in the aftermath of that?
Well, I had the 22 job offers. With every network, every syndicated show at the time, lots of syndicators. But the Tribune Company, who had brought me on to do the Al Capone's Vault and offered me $25,000. Remember, my nut was $50,000. They offered me $25,000. I said, if you give me $50,000, I'll come do it, because that's just enough to pay for 1 month's expenses. So that's what I got paid for the Al Capone's Vault story. But they had brought me, and they had done such a good job syndicating. Their idea was to do more specials and to do a pilot for a daytime talk show. At that time, you had Donahue and Oprah, and they said there's room for another one. And I did the pilot, I did the specials. The specials continued to rate, not at the historic levels of Al Capone's Vaults, but we made plenty of money doing it. And the really greased the skids for the launch of the daytime show. Now that Anderson's kind of following in my footsteps, I remembering back to the dawn of my daytime show. And started in 1987.
Right. How was the talk show different, let's say, from the other talk shows at the time, and what kind of topics
I said
did you cover?
It's funny that we just, we did the Oprah, there's pictures there, the Oprah reunion show of all the old talk show hosts last year. And as I explained to her on the air, as I said on the air, Donahue was brilliant because he was the first one to believe that the people who watch television in the daytime, largely housewives, had a brain. That you could do a show that had some intellectual aspect to it. I mean, to have fun and confrontation and silliness and all the rest, but Donahue was the first one. And Oprah was the first one to look like the audience, the daytime audience. I mean, it was brilliant. I mean, she was, a representative of, going back to the Eyewitness News days, it was the same idea. Right. People could relate to Oprah because she was so empathetic, and she had had such a rough beginning, and she made so much of herself. So they had those two. And what I brought, and what I said at the time, as I recall, was I brought a reporter sensibility to it. So we did a lot of stories that later I would do in some of the other contexts, and some of the broader, more news-like contexts. I would use a lot of them on my syndicated specials that I did. And later, a lot of them on Rivera Live when I started the cable show on CNBC.
Right.
But that's what I tried to bring to it. I tried to be a reporter as well as remembering some of the more flamboyant aspects of Goodnight America that made it entertaining.
Yeah. So, speaking of Rivera Live, what was on CNBC? What was the format of that show?
Well, here's how it happened. Excuse me. I was doing the talk show, and it was very successful. I was making a ton of money. It was like I had a money tree growing in my backyard. It was amazing, considering how modest my beginnings were. My dad never made more than $10,000 a year, and he was successful. But it wasn't enough for me, because once my nose got broken and I was on the cover of Newsweek in '88, I became like a punchline again. I became the personification of everything bad in television. The broken nose came to symbolize excess, and I didn't mind that too much. But then after a while, that was '88, and it was just the repetition of it, because we were doing a lot of good work. And I still say, if you were to look at my daytime talk show and the topics and how we handled them, we were much better than the rap. But I was getting the rap. And so I was just clicking through the dials one day, and lo and behold, who do I see on CNBC but Phil Donahue? And so here he is, the same guy I had looked at as the daytime pioneer was now bringing his skills, showing people that he has this guy's got a brain. He's got experiences. He's contributing to the national dialogue. And I just caught him on this cable channel station I had never watched, just flicking the dial. And I said, I want to do that. I'm smart. I have positions on these various issues. Let me do that. And I asked the Tribune people if they wouldn't mind, and they were only exclusive in terms of syndicated programming, so I had the right to do it, and they gave me their blessing because they perceived some positive aspect in the show also. And so I moved to Rivera Live, and who's my boss? Roger Ailes. So there's Roger Ailes, and he said, before I hire you, I got to know that you're not going to work so hard to undo the tabloid image that we're going to be watching paint drying or ice dripping like Sunday morning on CBS. And I said, Roger, you know me. I'm going to do something that people want to watch, and I can do this. And I tell you what, don't pay me much. Just give me ratings bonuses. And so that's what we did, basically. I went to work at CNBC for very little money. Had these ratings bonuses. The ratings of the whole network were 0.1 or 0.2. 100,000 or 200,000 people watching at any given time. Is the amount of, you could fit them all in a big football stadium. That was February, March of 1994, and guess what? In June of 1994, O.J. Simpson
I was going to ask,
got in a white Bronco, and we rewrote cable news history.
Right. I was going to ask you about that. I mean, Rivera Live becomes CNBC's #1 rated primetime program. Was it because capturing the O.J. Simpson's flight in the white Bronco and then staying with that story, was that the key?
The genius in a historical context to our coverage of that was very early on. I became the go-to place for every aspect of that. There was no court TV in those days. Headline news, if it existed, it did exist, but they didn't do trials. There was no cameras in the court, even in those days, or not much that were broadcast anyway. So we just stuck with the story, and there were enough people in the audience that from the 0.2 rating, the day of the verdict in the civil case in O.J. Simpson, we did a 6.2 rating. In other words, we had gone from a fraction to really dominating the national conversation about this phenomenal story. It was, in every sense, a tale of our times. I totally believe that the whole concept of concentrating on that one story, which has been adopted now by so many other outlets and so many other trials or serial kind of revelations, was legitimate, and it proved itself time and time again because it was a story about race, it was a story about social class, it was a story about celebrity and the power of celebrity. It was a story about the relationship between the black community and cops. It was a story about infidelity. It was a story about violent crime, innocent victimization of crime. It was so filled with so many important aspects of life. That's why it took off, not because it was just a murder. So it wasn't just a murder story. It was really a tale of our times. It was, and no one's really written it, but it really was. It could almost have been written by Charles Dickens.
And how helpful was it the fact that you're a lawyer?
There is no doubt that my legal training became instrumental in helping drive not only the angle for the coverage, but also the credibility in the angle for the coverage. People then became to look, once again, were regarding me not as the tabloid impresario, but as, he wasn't a bad lawyer. He was pretty sharp, and that's I didn't think of that, and that's admissible, inadmissible, prejudicial, probative. It's just the lingo we brought that lingo to television in a way now that you can't watch a day's cable news programming without Baby Lisa or
Right. They brought in the Jeffrey Toobins and
all the
the
rest
others.
of us.